Ladies and gentlemen, friends, we are going to have a small interruption in your dinner, but I think it is worth having this interruption because we have with us somebody who is, by his role, his responsibilities, at the core of many issues that we have been discussing this afternoon and will be discussing in the next 2 days. This is Mr. Mukhisa Kituyi, who is the Secretary General of UNCTAD. Now, UNCTAD, sorry to say that, might not be the kind of flamboyant UN organization when you hear about deliberation in the UN Security Council and this kind of high drama theater. But UNCTAD is a very important organization because it is dealing exactly with what we are talking today, tomorrow, on Tuesday, which is, in a way, how to integrate emerging market economies, new growth countries, into the global trade economic system, how to make them more active players and to make them greater beneficiaries in the way the global economy is being run. So, in a way, UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, is not only dealing with international trade investment issues, but it is really developing a kind of agenda for the emerging markets into a globalized world. So this is why UNCTAD is very important and relevant to our discussion. And you may remember, for those of you who were with us last year, that the former Secretary General of UNCTAD, in that time he was Secretary General, Dr. Supachai, was also last year a keynote speaker with us, and many of you remember his very, I would say, very strong and very relevant remarks. Now, I told you about the relevance of UNCTAD. I need to tell you now about the relevance of Mr. Mukhisa Kituyi, the Secretary General of UNCTAD, because Mr. Kituyi has exactly the kind of background, the kind of experience, the kind of perspective, I would say, that makes his analysis, his perspective, very important and relevant. Why would you say is he so relevant? Very simply, you look at his background. Mr. Kituyi has been an academic, he has been a parliamentarian, twice re-elected. He has been a minister of trade and industry. He has been into a number of advisory roles, influential advisory roles, and now he's the Secretary General of UNCTAD. So in a way, Mr. Kituyi, you have the academic background, you have, in a way, the political background as a member of parliament, you have the government background in terms of being in charge of elaborating and implementing policies at the national level, and now you have this global perspective. So this is why I think it would be interesting and important to hear your views. And what I would like to do, if in the 15 minutes of your remarks, is maybe to have 2 questions for you. Of course, we have spoken about the slowdown, but this is not a fatality. Emerging countries have ways to devise policies regarding middle class, regarding development of domestic consumption that will not only boost economic development, but will make them less vulnerable to the vagaries of international financial markets. And the second point that we would very much like to hear from you is what is on the mind of many people. Countries are now taking a new economic dynamism. They are developing, but they still don't have the right place when being able to assert their voice on how the global economy is being managed. How can they do that? How can they achieve this objective to, in a way, defend their interests, to create positions, in a way, for a more balanced, more inclusive global economic development? So, Mr. Kituyi, it is my great pleasure and honor to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, may I begin by thanking my hosts for inviting me to this meeting. One of the main reasons why I chose to make this my first trip to India since becoming Secretary General of UNCTAD is that on the basis of my discussions with Dr. Supachai when he was handing over the leadership of UNCTAD to me, I was convinced that it's about time to have a predictable calendar event, a discourse in New Delhi, where we pledge our respect and appreciation of the intellectual, political, and practical leadership of India among emerging economies for a desire to find refreshingly new and innovative ways of positioning emerging economies in the opinion leadership of the world. As an individual, I also wanted to make a statement that I respect the role and the history of this country in our jealous guarding of the right for an alternative opinion and an alternative model of growing capitalism and growing international engagement. I will make a few remarks and try to close in on some pointed remarks that my moderator has asked me to focus on. Ladies and gentlemen, for more than a decade, strong economic growth benefited the developing world substantially. Now, if I may quote from this sessionism title, there was a sense that the world was rising with the tide, that everybody was riding the tide created by a remarkable expansion of trade, investment, and growth, particularly so for emerging and developing countries. Even when the economic crisis flattened the advanced economies 5 years ago, the developing countries recovered more quickly than the more advanced ones. As recently as last year, developing countries accounted for about 2/3 of total global output growth. There were hopes for a kind of decoupling, as if the new global growth engines, the BRICS economies, could ride a different tide, even create their own new tide to lift regional growth and support the global economy. When we at UNCTAD addressed this meeting at roughly about this time last year, our session was entitled Sustaining the Dynamics in Emerging Markets, because the resilience of emerging markets and developing economies was a bright spot in a lackluster world economy. A year on, however, this resilience is losing steam. Absent is a recovery of demand from traditional northern counterparts, and facing stumbling growth in the BRICS economies more recently, we face the question of this year's growth networks meeting. How do we reverse the tide and revive growth? I am enjoying the benefit of being a dinner time speaker. And when you're speaking at dinner, you are supposed to give comic relief to what has been going on in a busy, intellectually engaging day. So I'm allowed to try to make you enjoy yourselves after a very demanding moment earlier. And in this vein, I would like to invite you to think this way. It is indeed about time that we abandoned the concept of the tide in economics. The tide of metaphor, which has been abandoned especially in recent years, comes with some problems. Some said a rising tide lifts all boats during the propitious decade that came to a crashing end in 2007. Now, many countries did not benefit from the fundamental conditions that were boosting traditional international trade at the time. While some succeeded, the metaphor of the tide lifting all boats was not confirmed. While some grew rapidly, others did not. Some of those which grew did not create enough of the jobs needed to sustain that growth. Export-led sectors flourished, while employment grew much slowly in other sectors. Those working in finance benefited, while incomes elsewhere stayed flat or even fell. So, it's not true that all boats were lifted, nor was the lifting sustainable for those that were. After the crisis, you might think that now the tide has gone out, so we can see who is not wearing a bathing suit. But little has been done to learn the lessons that crisis brought to us. The changes to the financial sector that are needed to protect against a repeat crisis still need to be put into place. Expansionary monetary policies initiated in advanced economies have spillover effects, prompting billions of dollars to flood into emerging economies, causing the exchange rates to appreciate rapidly, only to reverse just as quickly as perception of risks changed. Indeed, one of the lessons that we can learn from the recent experience of the change in policies in America on tapering is how global value chains in financial markets increase vulnerabilities. That the moment artificial regulation downwards of interest rates in the US is lifted, the ripple effect has major effects, particularly on emerging markets. Our challenge is how do we learn from the mistakes of this kind of practice? The massive flows of short-term capital did not spark an increase in productive investment that developing countries needed if they were to finance structural transformation of their economies. Ironically, there is a global surplus of capital, while enterprises find it very difficult to raise finance. You could say the tide may seem to have risen everywhere, but there's not a drop of water to drink. Our view at UNCTAD is that the boom of the previous decade was not a natural or ordained response to getting the fundamentals right, nor was the crisis that followed the natural ebb to the decade's flow. The tidal metaphor is misleading because the movement of the tides are an immutable force of nature that you can do little about, whereas economic performance is determined by economic policy and the choices that we make, both nationally and internationally. The boom years were a product of a favorable external environment created by national and international economic policy. And the subsequent crisis was a systemic response to imbalances that resulted from the unbridled application of many of those same policies. Policy drove the remarkable turnaround of the Chinese economy in recent decades, bringing millions of people, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty on the basis of carefully sequenced, cautious liberalization combined with growth-oriented heterodox economic policies. China did not wait for any natural ebb and flow. Instead, its policies helped to create the conditions that were needed. A few months ago, at a retreat of the Chief Executive Board, I told the President of the World Bank and the Managing Director of IMF that I've heard everybody congratulating themselves that the world has achieved the Millennium Development Goal #1, halving extreme poverty. But the reality is that the Chinese Communist Party contributed more than the World Bank and IMF in the halving of extreme poverty in the world. That's a reality we don't like talking about, but it's a reality that's very instructive. There is a lot that can be done, and tools exist with which we can change the situation. Most importantly, developing countries, and particularly the emerging economies among them, need to change the strategic nature of the integration into the global economy. It's clear that the old routes to economic growth do not exist anymore. To take just one example, the potential for global trade that existed in previous decades is unlikely to be revived because sources of external demand may remain limited for some time to come. World economic growth was estimated to be around 2.4% in 2012, down from both 2011 and 2010, as the advanced economies continue to suffer very slow recovery. Growth for the advanced economies was at an average 1.3%, around half of the pre-crisis level. Developing countries who previously relied on their position in global value chains, exporting to advanced economic markets, now seek value chains aimed at the emerging class of mass consumers in the developing world. Ideally, they might create their own new value chains. It's not only the fact that traditional markets in the advanced economies show slim signs of recovering their former dynamism. The decoupling story has lost its appeal. According to our thinking and our recent estimates, GDP growth in India in 2013 is around 5%, less than half the level achieved in 2010. China's growth of 7.6% in 2013 is about 2 percentage lower than 2 years earlier. Brazil, South Africa, the other large emerging markets are also feeling a drag on their growth. Now, one way to help achieve a virtuous circle of expanding output and trade is to boost domestic and regional demand in the South. As historical export-led development strategies have become less viable, promoting domestic demand requires more balanced strategies that reconsider the role of wages, focusing less on the role of worker wages as a cost to production, and more strategically on their role as the main source of new demand. Policies or practices that clamp down on wages to boost exports have the misguided effect of reducing domestic consumption, undermining domestic supplier effects, and reducing government tax revenues. In this regard, I'm encouraged by the revival of concern about inequality and fresh evidence supporting our long-held argument that inequality is bad for economic stability and growth. Earlier today, you have been discussing the model of Brazil, and there seems to be concurrence that the direction of expanding a domestic middle class, growing a sustainable domestic consumer, is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the policy measures that are sustainable. National income policies and a heightened redistributive role for governments are important tools in the process of moving to a more sustainable growth strategy for developing and emerging markets. Public expenditure, if appropriately directed, is another powerful means of promoting equality and development, whether through infrastructure investment, education, or social services development. It can greatly contribute to structural transformation and sustained growth. Another useful policy tool are what we may call public development banks, which have been regaining a popularity that they had lost over a long time, not just in the developing countries, but even in the more developed countries. It's an instructive thing that the countries among the emerging markets which performed best during the recent crisis, the ending crisis, are those which retained a steady influence in the availability of competitively sustainable credit. They may be called any other thing, but the reality is development banks gave a bedrock of predictable financing that was the antithesis of the rapidly moving portfolio finance, speculative investments that have caused two of the main shocks, particularly in emerging economies, over the period that, over the past 15 to 20 years. I think as leaders in enterprise and in economic thinking, you must buttress the long-term relevance and critical importance, I think, of predictable financial markets as a core concern for emerging economies, and if you like, for the global south. Because I consider these essential parts of a healthy and robust financial system, dependable in good and bad times. Domestic demand will also be boosted by stronger South-South and regional economic ties. Countries that already had strong South-South links were better able to weather this crisis than those which had weak regional links. There is critical need for enhancing South-South and regional integration in this period. These links can be reinforced institutionally through, for example, simple trade-related payment systems to reduce exposure to volatile foreign currencies, or more complex exchange rate mechanisms to reduce transactional costs of trade. But South-South and regional cooperation can go even further through what we at UNCTAD have been calling developmental regionalism. This entails not only simplifying procedures for trade, but deepening trade value to non-tradable sectors of the economies. Regional mechanisms can provide short-term finance when countries experience balance of payment deficits. Regional approaches to growth promote industrial policy, and they are most importantly tested and found to be useful. In Latin America, for example, they were a critical pillar for resilient regional growth after a very turbulent period. We want to encourage you to think about the possibilities. Even if you don't have regional integration, at least have regional coordination of national policies as a source of strength for developing countries searching for new motors of growth in very uncertain international environment. By adopting a more domestic and regional focus, developing economies can avoid the beggar-thy-neighbor policies, which promote contradictory wage and tax races to the bottom that used to be inherent in the old-type export-led competitive strategies, particularly the hallmark of the textile industry with its attendant problems you've seen in this neighborhood. There are also clear benefits from a globally collaborative pro-growth approach. Our latest trade and development report shows that in a scenario where there are neither policy changes nor shocks ahead, global GDP growth is estimated to rise only slowly and to peak at around 3% by the year 2030. However, if all countries pursued more expansionary macroeconomic policies to the extent needed to ensure growth-enhancing environment in each country, global GDP growth prospects more than double. This reinforces my argument that the economic environment is a product of policy more than of nature, like the tide. And if such a globally coordinated effort is politically out of reach, there are still significant benefits to be gained if only the developing and transition economies followed such an expansionary path together. In the case of India, for example, GDP growth could rise sharply to 10% per annum by around 2020 with coordinated growth policies on the part of the major world economies, and could still rise strongly to over 7% if only the developing and emerging transition economies followed such a path. Ladies and gentlemen, I did not want to take away from the pleasures of your dinner after a laborious day. I just wanted you to feel encouraged that while we share the concerns of global pessimism in the recovery, rather than considering ourselves forever as victims of a tide that rolls in and rolls out with the movement of the moon, we have the policies and the know-how toolkit to engage in the construction of new structural conditions that can determine the pace of recovery from the current morass. The economic tide is not an immutable force. It's an economic construct that is influenced by human policy. This means that it can be reversed and redirected by purposeful human action. Thank you very much. And I want to wish you very fruitful discussions.
Before the main course, we have time for one or two questions. Is there any question that you would like to raise following up on the remarks, which I think are fully in line and very much in complementarity to what we have been discussed this whole afternoon? Any question? Carlos, can we bring a mic at the table there? Here it is.
Thank you, Secretary General, for your presentation. I can't resist, as a former director of the World Bank, to put this question to you. You mentioned that the Communist Party in China made more for the achievement of MDG 1 than the World Bank and the IMF. Would you agree that the Communist Party of China made more for South-South increase in trade than UNCTAD?
Okay, first, there was no competition between UNCTAD and the Communist Party of China on expanding a viable, tangible market. Yeah, but I could say the context in which I brought this to the attention of Mr. Kim, Dr. Kim, was that while we were discussing the architecture of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, post-2015, one of the lessons we must learn from MDG is that countries which had a structure and a purpose that is global had better success in achieving social indicators of success than countries that made economic goals as a supermarket to buy items. So countries which went out to build a certain number of public toilets and certain homes delivery of water, certain number of malaria case reversals, did not do as well as countries which had comprehensive structural transformation goals, including giving people sustainable livelihoods as the main motor that led to achieving social indicators of success. In that case, China had the tools, the resources, and the capacity to contribute better than UNCTAD.
Okay. We had this hand first here. Oh my God, we are going to have dinner at 1 o'clock in the morning then. But Whitney, you have then, my friend here. Whitney, no, Whitney first. Oh my God, the mic is now being hijacked.
Okay, no problem. It's a very simple question, sir. It's about Gini index, extreme differences in poverty, and I put it very statistically. It's from normal distribution curve from 3 sigma to minus 3 sigma, rather minus 6 sigma. People are so poor in the countries, like 6 people of the whole family begging on the red lights of Delhi or many cities in the world even. How to resolve it? That's very simple.
Okay. I can take the next question as well.
Whitney?
I won't do any math here. Mr. Secretary General, I was very interested in your concept of developmental regionalism. And regional integration is clearly a driver for more trade and economic development. And on the continent of Africa, the AU is committed to a continental free trade area. Now, this is a policy decision by the leaders of the country, but it seems to be honored more in promise than reality. How do we move the region to reality?
Okay, let us take a third question here and you will answer the 3.
My name is Ravi Chaudhary. Mr. Kituyi, listening to you, I got the impression that the problems of the world you outlined are well known. The solutions are also quite well known. But it appears to me that the lens through which the policymakers look at the problems is rather elitist in the world. Whereas the problems are confined to the bottom 1/2 of the population. And there's a disconnect between the lens through which we view the problems and the lens through which we need to seek the solutions. What's your view on that, sir?
Okay, thank you. I will try to answer those questions in reverse order. The sense of problems can be objectively felt across the board. So I'll say, to a large extent, problems are well known, but I don't think it's similarly expansively known what possible solutions. Because there are ideological blinkers to the solutions. If you look at turbulence in financial markets, an overdevelopment of deregulated financial markets allowed hostile products to intervene, speculative capital to be cleansed and be categorized as a FDI, with its attendant recklessness and therefore its attendant impact on global markets. If you like, some of the problems we have seen caused by some hedge funds and speculative movement of short-term capital are a principal reason why the largest reservoir of capital, sovereign funds, pension funds, are hesitant to be put out as developmental funds. And we're missing an opportunity on a major chunk of available monies to drive global recovery. There are different perspectives and ideological positions on implementing of solutions. But in the tradition of an organization that I lead, we stand on the side of the South in saying what seems to make sense to the South. We don't think the South will fix the world's problems, but it can contribute the largest share of solving the South's problems. I think that's where I will start. But I think we have also to move with caution. The notions of a robust emergent South have been used as an excuse by some countries to retreat from the international obligations of ODA. While we acknowledge and appreciate the important leadership emerging from emerging economies, we cannot transfer obligations on overseas, on development commitments by the advanced economies. It's a problem we're already seeing, declining enthusiasm to make commitments for financing of SDGs. And we will see increasing attention to pushing the bucket to private sector or asking for countries to carry their cross. But this is, I think, a direction we should not allow to be legitimized by emphasizing the important role that the South can play. On questions of regional integration, particularly for developing countries, I find regional integration very important. And to me, developmental regionalism has a qualitative difference from just regional integration, because regional integration is first and foremost about trade facilitation. It's about simplifying customs procedures, standardizing customs documentation, improving transparency in customs transaction, reducing the cost of trade logistics. It is neutral to the different quality and vulnerabilities of players. You can have massive expansion in trade because of regional integration without growing the economies. We just enhance extractive economies. Good for the political elites, but majority of the population in a lot of the developing countries are in untradable sectors. And therefore they're left out of the benefits of enhanced trade. Developmental regionalism must start with a strong emphasis on organic linkage between entrepreneurship development, intra-sector social development, and the growth of movement of goods and services. Part of the dilemma that we face, I have been involved a lot negotiating both as chairman of SCP ministers and Africa trade ministers, is our relationship with the USA and Europe. I'll give you an example. I come from Kenya. Kenya is part of a common market of East Africa. They are negotiating economic partnership agreement with Europe, with the European Union. If all of Kenya's neighbors do not sign an EPA.
What is EPA?
Economic Partnership Agreement. They will continue exporting everything to Europe duty-free, quota-free, because of being LDC. Because Kenya is not an LDC. If it fails to sign, automatically it will start paying high duty on its export to Europe. So all investors in Kenya who export to Europe will relocate their production to neighboring countries because of greater market access to Europe. So regional integration is punished by unequal access to an external market. So there are dynamics like these, nuances, mostly driven by the North, that slow down the train of regional integration. But I think the biggest challenge in the South is complete value chains that are not dependent ultimately on the market to the North, that will allow for greater and deeper regional integration and long-term sustainability. About the Gini index and the dilemma you were talking about, which is reflected in Brazil, I think you have to strike a balance. There are levels beyond which you cannot go in triggering domestic consumption. But there is an absolute necessary that it takes political will to run an economy whose intelligentsia believes that an improved income of the working class is an economic good for the entrepreneur. It's not a drag on profits. Sometimes you could say countries like Brazil tried it, maybe it was a bit too ambitious. But sustainably, you have to strike a balance somewhere that it is good to balance between taxation and wage increases as part of growing a dependable domestic consumer base.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kituyi, I think you have brought quite a number of complementary and new elements which were fully in line with what has been the thread of our discussion this morning. We will have a discussion on trade and trade facilitation. We will have also a discussion about how to manage risk for emerging countries, and of course, this emphasis on domestic market is a very important mitigating factor. We have discussed more inclusive growth, and we will get back to that in 2 sessions over the course of the next 2 days. So thank you so much for your contribution to our discussion. And once again, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. I wish you very successful discussions. I wish I could have been present to participate in the rest tomorrow, but I have to head back to Geneva tonight.
I know.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we appreciate the effort.